Now you might be wondering, why did I do that dramatic pause? Well, because I'm thinking about it, and I may end up separating these two videos for length, but just in case, I might also cram them together, or I might do both, because they're not mutually exclusive. And speaking of mutually exclusive, we got to address the second part of Vivek Ramaswamy's tweet, which is actually chronologically the first part, the first two sentences. We're not a direct democracy. We are a constitutional republic. So this is a phrase that you have undoubtedly heard from Republicans and conservatives, people like Ben Shapiro, Charlie Kirk, Mike Lee, Senator Mike Lee of Utah, like 3 or 4 years ago, went viral for just tweeting, "We are not a democracy." This is a common and increasingly popular right-wing sentiment. And now Vivek Ramaswamy was the kind of the prelude to his pitch that we need to raise the voting age from 18 to 25. Now, the problem is that any political scientist worth their salt would tell you it's a really stupid sentiment. We're not a democracy, we're a republic. Well, we're both, right? They're not mutually exclusive, certainly not in the United States context. So let's just unpack this a bit. There is a great article in the Baffler, and it was written, 4 years ago by Ed Bermilla. We're a republic, not a democracy. A political usage guide for the feckless commentariat. And it's a very well written, very witty article. It's got the SpongeBob meme superimposed over the portrait of the founding fathers at one of the constitutional conventions. And I'm not going to read the whole article here, but I am going to point out some highlights. So James Madison, who may reasonably speak to the ideas underlying the Constitution, since he wrote it, and did the future generations the favor of explaining exactly what republic and democracy meant to his clique, the founding fathers. In the Federalist Papers, a pure democracy, by which I mean a society consisting of a small number of citizens who assemble and administer the government in person, can admit of no cure for the mischiefs of faction. So James Madison is defining a democracy as a small state, a very small number of people comprised of a small number of citizens, and all of them take a role in actively administering the government. That's how he's defining democracy. Then in Federalist number 39, we may define a republic to be, or at least may bestow that name on, a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. Then briefly to circle back to Federalist 10 in case anyone missed the point. The two great points of difference between a democracy and a republic are, according to James Madison, first, the delegation of the government, in the latter, to a small number of citizens elected by the rest. Secondly, the greater number of citizens in the greater sphere of the country over which the latter may be extended. To declare that America is not a democracy is as useful as pointing out that it's not a monarchy or that the Pope wears a funny hat. So this is the point. To the founding fathers, a democracy was basically rule by referenda. The idea that, way back in ancient Greece or in the city-states of ancient Greece or ancient Rome or all these things, that you had a very, very, very small state or country, dozens or maybe hundreds of people. And all of the citizens not only voted for people, but they actively administered. They did the day-to-day work of government. They voted on everything. They drafted legislation. They enforced the laws, everything. They were active participants in government the way that our government does now. That's how they defined a democracy. And of course that's unworkable. As James Madison writes in the Federalist Papers, there's no way to apply that to scale. You can't have a government of rule by referenda where literally every decision is up to, majority rule by every citizen on a day-to-day basis. Like, imagine how government could possibly work if every piece of legislation had to be discussed and debated by every single person, and this is just drafting it, let alone debating it, let alone amending it, let alone getting it out of committee. Every committee couldn't be comprised of 12 elected representatives, but in our case, 330 million people, because that's the population of the United States. James Madison was simply making a case against logistics. It's not possible for every person to be an active day-to-day member of the government. He's saying that a republic, right? The republic, the greater number of citizens and the greater sphere of the country, a republic is better given the scale because the people are from what the government derives its power, all its power. All its power derives from the great body of the people who elect a small number of citizens to do the day-to-day work of government. Democracy and republic are not mutually exclusive in the sense that they both derive their power from majority rule, okay? And that's really what this is about. See, as George Thomas, a political scientist, wrote in The Atlantic, he had a great piece in The Atlantic, high-minded claims that we are not a democracy surreptitiously fuse republic with minority rule rather than popular government. So every time Mike Lee and Vivek Ramaswamy and others talk about how we're a republic, what they're trying to play is a rhetorical sleight of hand. They're trying to convince you that a republic means minority rule because they recognize their party, their ideology, is in the minority. They understand that if America is a popularity contest, Republicans lose every time. They have to constantly rig the game in their favor. Their ideas are not as popular. Their record is not as good. Their policies are less effective. So what do they have to do? They have to appeal and try to bend institutions to their norm to create minority rule. High-minded claims that we're not a democracy surreptitiously fuse republic with minority rule rather than popular government. Enabling sustained minority rule at the national level is not a feature of our constitutional design, but a perversion of it. Routine minority rule is neither desirable nor sustainable and makes it difficult to characterize the country as either a democracy or a republic. We should see this as a constitutional failure demanding constitutional reform. So let's be very clear about this. The United States is a democratic republic. We are, the vast majority of our mechanisms, the overwhelming majority of our mechanisms, depend on majority rule, even on a case-by-case basis. Supreme Court decisions, how are they decided? By a majority of the justices. Legislation, how does it pass one chamber into the next? Majority rule. Now, sometimes it has to be a supermajority, right? A decisive majority, to be sure, but it is majority. Even the presidency, the only national level office over which there are any form of elections, you could say, well, the Electoral College, it's an indirect form of voting, but still a majority of Electoral College votes, right? Majority rule is the standard, the constitutional standard by which government functions. Now, again, that's not to say that there are not and should not be enshrined minority rights. But the Founding Fathers did indeed intend for the majority to govern. Now, obviously, their view of the majority was profoundly flawed. It didn't include women. It didn't include black people. It didn't include minorities. It was white landowning men. So their conception was flawed, morally flawed, intellectually flawed, and had to be changed over time. They didn't have all the answers. They didn't have all the moral high ground. But if we're really appealing to what the founders intended, minority rule versus majority rule, it's pretty clearly majority rule, right? Even think of this. In the Constitution, what was the role of the vice president in terms of the legislature? To break a tie. In the event that in the Senate, there were, however many votes, 50, well, now it could be 50-50, right? Because we have 50 states, each state has 2 senators, blah, blah, blah. In the event that there is a tie in the Senate, the vice president was empowered to break that tie by just one vote. Even a bare, basic minimum majority was all that was needed to pass legislation. The Constitution, yes, affords minority rights, but does not endorse or support minority rule. Majority rule is clearly the thing that governs the country. The minority is simply a brake check. That's all it is. Hey, are you sure we need to do this? Maybe this is a bad idea. We're going to complicate this a bit. We're going to try to cool things down, make it deliberative. But as one of the articles say, and I'll try to find it here. Here it is. As James Madison argued in Federalist number 63, the cool and deliberate sense of the community ought, in all governments, and actually will, in all free governments, ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. So yes, James Madison saying, look, it shouldn't be, these spurious and intemperate passions. It shouldn't be a flight of fancy which governs the country. But majority rule, the cool and deliberate sense of the community, the majority, in all governments, should ultimately prevail over the views of its rulers. The Founding Fathers clearly intended majority rule. And the only reason that you hear this phrase, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, is because those who say it recognize that their views are in the minority, and that's not going to change anytime soon. And they think they should govern over the majority in all instances. They're the ones defying the Constitution. They're the ones having an a constitutional view, and they need to make peace with it.